The Silk Road, which operated in various forms for roughly 1,500 years from around 200 BCE to 1400 CE, wasn't a single road but a network of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, and it created the first true millionaires in the modern sense. Individuals whose wealth came not from landholding or political position or inheritance, but from commerce, from buying goods in one market and selling them thousands of miles away at enormous markup. And these merchant millionaires were fundamentally different from earlier wealthy elites. They weren't kings or nobles or priests whose wealth derived from their position in social hierarchy. They were private individuals who accumulated fortunes through trade, through understanding arbitrage opportunities, through taking risks and organizing complex logistics. And they created financial and organizational innovations that would become foundations of modern capitalism: bills of exchange, partnerships, insurance, multinational family firms, all emerged from the needs of long-distance trade along the Silk Road, and the wealth they accumulated, while it may not seem enormous by modern standards when you account for inflation and economic growth, was staggering relative to their societies. Individual merchants accumulated fortunes equivalent to millions or tens of millions of modern dollars, enough to live in luxury, fund religious institutions, influence politics, and establish dynasties that would remain wealthy for generations. And understanding how they did this, what they traded and how they organized their businesses and what innovations they developed, reveals the origins of commercial capitalism, shows how trade creates wealth in ways that agriculture and manufacturing alone cannot, and demonstrates that globalization and the accompanying concentration of wealth in merchant hands isn't new or modern, but has ancient precedents. The fundamental economics were simple. China produced silk and porcelain and tea and spices that were extremely valuable in the West. The Mediterranean world produced wool and glass and gold and various luxury goods valuable in the East. And between China and the Mediterranean were thousands of miles of difficult terrain, mountains and deserts and steppes. Crossing them was dangerous and expensive. But if you could move goods across that distance, the price differential was enormous. Silk that cost 1 unit in China could sell for 100 units in Rome. The markup covered the transportation costs and risks and still left massive profits. And this price differential existed because the goods being traded were luxuries with high value-to-weight ratios. Silk was light and compact and extremely valuable, perfect for long-distance trade. A camel could carry enough silk to be worth a fortune, whereas bulk goods like grain or timber couldn't be profitably traded across such distances, because the transportation costs exceeded the value. So the Silk Road trade was exclusively in luxuries, items consumed by elites, and the merchants who organized this trade captured much of the value difference between Eastern and Western prices. They didn't produce anything, didn't farm or manufacture. They just moved goods. But in moving them, they created enormous value, transformed silk worth little in China into silk worth fortunes in Rome. And this arbitrage, this exploitation of price differentials between markets, was the source of merchant wealth. The organizational challenge was immense. No single merchant could actually travel the entire Silk Road. The distances were too great. The journey would take years. The risks were prohibitive. So the trade was organized through relay. Goods would pass through multiple hands. Chinese merchants would sell to Central Asian merchants at one of the oasis cities along the desert routes. Those merchants would transport the goods further west and sell to Persian or Arab merchants, who would sell to Mediterranean merchants. And at each stage the price would increase, each merchant taking profit for the segment they handled. And this meant trust and verification were crucial. You needed to trust that the merchant you were selling to would pay, that the goods you were buying were genuine and of the quality claimed, that the quantity matched what was promised. And enforcement of contracts across thousands of miles and multiple jurisdictions was essentially impossible. You couldn't sue a merchant in another empire who cheated you. So trade depended on reputation and on ethnic and religious networks that provided trust. Armenian merchants would trade with other Armenians, Jewish merchants with other Jews, Sogdian merchants with other Sogdians. These diaspora communities created trust networks that spanned the Silk Road, and merchants who cheated would be excluded from the network, would lose access to the credit and information and partnerships they needed. So reputation. Enforcement through community networks substituted for legal enforcement. The Sogdians were perhaps the most important merchant community in the early Silk Road. They were an Iranian people from what's now Uzbekistan, and from roughly the 3rd to 8th century CE, they dominated Central Asian trade. Sogdian merchants established colonies and cities from China to Persia, maintained trade networks across thousands of miles, spoke multiple languages, understood the cultures and customs of different regions they traded in, and accumulated enormous wealth. Sogdian merchant houses were multi-generational family firms that maintained operations across continents. And while we don't have precise numbers for individual fortunes, the archaeological evidence of Sogdian merchant tombs shows extraordinary wealth, elaborate burials with gold and silver and luxury goods from across Eurasia, and Sogdian merchants funded Buddhist temples and monasteries along the trade routes, which required substantial capital, so they were clearly operating at a scale that made them extremely wealthy by their era's standards. And their wealth came purely from commerce, from organizing trade and taking a cut of the massive value being created by moving goods between markets. The innovations Sogdian and other Silk Road merchants developed were crucial to later commercial development. They created sophisticated credit instruments, early versions of bills of exchange, where a merchant could deposit money in one city and receive a letter of credit that could be redeemed in another city, avoiding the need to transport actual coins or precious metals, which was risky and expensive. These letters of credit required trust networks to function. The merchant in the destination city had to trust that the letter was genuine and that he'd be compensated. But once these networks existed, they enabled much more efficient trade. Merchants could travel light, carrying letters instead of coins, and could settle balances periodically rather than requiring payment for each transaction. And this financial innovation enabled larger volumes of trade, more complex transactions, and reduced the risks that had constrained earlier commerce. It was an early version of the financial infrastructure that would later enable global capitalism. The family firm structure that dominated Silk Road trade was another innovation. These weren't corporations in the modern sense, with shareholders and limited liability. They were partnerships among family members, usually brothers or fathers and sons, who would establish operations in different cities and coordinate their activities. One brother would be in Samarkand, another in Chang'an, another in Baghdad, and they'd share information about prices and availability, coordinate their buying and selling to maximize profits, support each other with credit. And this structure was more efficient than individual merchants operating independently, because the family firm could arbitrage price differences across multiple markets simultaneously, could carry inventory in different locations, could respond to changing conditions across a wide geography. And the family bonds provided the trust necessary for this coordination. You could rely on your brother to act in the family firm's interest in ways you couldn't rely on an unrelated partner, and successful merchant families could maintain these firms for generations, passing the business from fathers to sons, accumulating capital over time, reinvesting profits into expanding operations, and growing extraordinarily wealthy. The wealth accumulation process was exponential once merchants achieved a certain scale, because capital could be reinvested to increase volumes and expand into new routes and products. A merchant starting with modest capital might make a profit of 50% on a journey, which was possible given the price differentials, reinvest that profit in the next journey with larger inventory, make 50% again on a larger base, and repeat this process over years and decades. And if you could, make 50% return annually and reinvest all profits, your capital would grow exponentially, doubling every couple of years. And while the actual returns were more variable, and there were losses and setbacks, the fundamental dynamic was that successful merchants could grow their capital much faster than agricultural wealth grew. A landowner's wealth grew with population and productivity of his lands, incrementally over generations. But a merchant's wealth could grow explosively in a single generation if he was successful. And this made commerce a path to wealth that hadn't existed in earlier societies where wealth was essentially fixed, determined by your birth. Merchants proved that you could start with relatively little and become extremely wealthy through skill and luck and risk-taking. This was genuinely new, genuinely revolutionary, even though only a small number succeeded. Most merchants failed or remained modest, but the possibility of spectacular success through commerce changed social structures. The most famous individual merchant from the Silk Road era is probably not from the classical period, but from the later medieval period. Marco Polo's family were Venetian merchants who traveled the Silk Road to China in the late 13th century. And while Marco Polo himself is famous for his travel account, his family were serious merchants who accumulated significant wealth through their trade. They weren't the wealthiest merchants of their era, but they represent the pattern, Venetian. Merchant families operating across vast distances, maintaining operations in multiple cities, accumulating wealth through long-distance trade. And the Polo family's success came from direct contact with China rather than operating through intermediaries. They established relationships with Mongol rulers who controlled the Silk Road at that time, got preferential access to Chinese goods, and brought back products that they could sell at enormous markups in Venice, and the wealth they accumulated elevated them in Venetian society, though they remained below the truly elite merchant families like the Cornaro or Mocenigo who had been accumulating wealth for generations. The Arab and Persian merchants who dominated the maritime silk routes, the sea routes connecting the Middle East to India and Southeast Asia and China, achieved similar or greater wealth than the overland merchants. And they had advantages. Sea transport was cheaper and safer than overland transport once you had the navigation technology. A ship could carry far more cargo than a camel caravan. And the maritime routes avoided the Central Asian territories that were often unstable and dangerous. So Islamic merchants from the 9th century onward increasingly used sea routes, establishing trading posts from East Africa to Indonesia. And some of these merchants accumulated legendary fortunes. The sources describe merchants with fleets of ships, warehouses in multiple ports, agents across the Indian Ocean. These were large-scale operations generating enormous profits. And these merchants funded mosques and schools and became politically influential in their home cities. The wealth concentrated in merchant hands in cities like Baghdad and Cairo and later in Gujarat and Calicut was substantial enough to support cultural and architectural achievements. Merchant wealth funded much of Islamic Golden Age scholarship and building. Merchants were patrons of science and philosophy and art. And this was wealth generated purely through trade, through understanding markets and organizing complex logistics. The Chinese merchants operating on the eastern end of the Silk Road were constrained by Confucian ideology that viewed merchants as parasitic and lowly, below farmers and artisans in the social hierarchy. And Chinese state policy often restricted merchant activity, imposed price controls, monopolized certain trades. But despite these restrictions, Chinese merchants accumulated substantial wealth, particularly in periods when state control loosened. During the Song Dynasty, 960-1279 CE, Chinese merchants were extremely active in maritime trade throughout Southeast Asia, and some became very wealthy enough to build elaborate homes and gardens, to educate their sons for civil service exams, to essentially buy their way into gentry status. And the fact that they did this despite ideological disapproval and state restrictions shows how profitable trade was. The returns were high enough that merchants persisted despite being socially stigmatized, and the wealth of Chinese merchants, while perhaps not reaching the heights of the wealthiest Western or Islamic merchants, was still substantial, and Chinese merchant networks extending through Southeast Asia and into the Indian Ocean became increasingly important in the later centuries of the Silk Road era. The decline of the Silk Road from the 14th century onward came from multiple factors. The Mongol Empire's collapse fragmented the overland routes. The Black Death disrupted trade networks. The Ming Dynasty in China turned inward and restricted foreign trade. And most importantly, European maritime exploration created new routes to Asia, Portuguese ships reaching India in 1498 and China shortly after. These maritime routes were faster, cheaper, and safer than the overland Silk Road, and they bypassed the Middle Eastern and Central Asian intermediaries who had taken cuts of the trade, allowing European merchants to trade directly with Asian producers. And this shifted wealth from the traditional Silk Road merchants to European maritime trading companies. And the merchant fortunes being created in the 16th and 17th centuries were larger than Silk Road fortunes had been. The Fuggers in Germany, the Medici in Italy, the great merchant houses of Amsterdam and London. These reached new levels of wealth as European merchants came to dominate global trade, but they were building on foundations laid by Silk Road merchants, using similar organizational structures, similar financial instruments, similar networks of trust. The methods that had developed over centuries of Silk Road trade were adapted and scaled up by European merchant capitalism. The legacy of Silk Road merchants is that they proved commerce could create wealth rivaling or exceeding that of landholders and rulers. They showed that organizing trade across distances and cultures could generate enormous profits. They created financial and organizational innovations that would become standard in later capitalism. Bills of exchange, family firms, diaspora networks. All these came from Silk Road trade. And they demonstrated that wealth didn't have to be zero-sum. That trade could create value rather than just redistributing it. Moving silk from China to Rome didn't take wealth from China or create it in Rome at China's expense. It created new value by putting the silk in the hands of people who valued it more highly. And capturing some of that created value was how merchants became wealthy. This understanding that trade creates value rather than just moving it around was crucial to the later development of market capitalism, and it came from the experience of long-distance trade along the Silk Road. Merchants saw that they weren't just redistributing existing wealth, but creating new wealth through arbitrage, and this justified their profits and their growing social position. The question of whether these first millionaires deserved their wealth or were exploitative is complex. They didn't produce anything themselves, didn't grow or make the goods they traded. They just moved them, and the markups they charged were enormous, often 10 times or 100 times the original price. So you could argue they were extracting value without creating it, profiting from information asymmetries and transportation monopolies. On the other hand, they provided genuine service. They connected markets that wouldn't have been connected otherwise, made available to Roman consumers goods they couldn't get any other way, and the prices Roman consumers paid, while high, were prices they were willing to pay. The value to them exceeded the price, or they wouldn't have bought. So in that sense, the merchants were creating value by facilitating exchange, and the risks they took were real. Caravans were attacked, ships sank. Merchants lost everything relatively frequently, so the high profits when successful were compensation for the high risks, and the organizational skills and cultural knowledge required to operate across such distances and differences were rare and valuable. Not everyone could do what successful Silk Road merchants did, so perhaps their wealth was earned through rare skills and risk-taking rather than exploitation. The Silk Road created the first millionaires in the sense of creating a merchant class whose wealth came from commerce rather than land or position, whose fortunes could exceed those of nobles and could be accumulated in a single generation rather than inherited over many generations. And these merchant millionaires were concentrated in certain cities: Samarkand and Bokhara in Central Asia, Venice and Genoa in Italy, Baghdad and Cairo in the Islamic world, Canton in China. These became extremely wealthy cities because of their position in trade networks. And the merchant fortunes accumulated there were invested in architecture and culture, creating the splendor that we associate with these cities, the magnificent buildings and art and learning, much of it funded by merchant wealth. And this pattern would repeat in later eras, Amsterdam and London becoming wealthy from trade, New York and Hong Kong from finance and commerce, the concentration of wealth in trading cities. Because that's where arbitrage opportunities could be exploited and where the financial and organizational infrastructure existed to support complex commerce. This is a pattern that began with the Silk Road, the first truly global trade network, and the first merchants who figured out how to organize and profit from it became the first millionaires. Wealthy beyond what their societies had previously seen from commercial activity, wealthy enough to challenge traditional hierarchies, to buy influence and status, to establish families that would remain prominent for generations, and to demonstrate that commerce was a path to wealth that could rival or exceed the traditional paths of conquest and landholding. And in doing so, they created the foundations for the commercial capitalism that would eventually transform the world. All of it beginning with silk and spices and porcelain moving slowly across Central Asian deserts, carried by camels and merchants who understood that in the price differential between markets lay fortunes waiting to be made, and who had the courage and skill and luck to make them.